You ever stare at yourself in the mirror long enough to wonder if the person staring back is really you? That was the last thing my father ever said to me before he vanished. No note, no signs of struggle, just an empty apartment and a broken mirror. 12 years later, I found myself back in his old place. A man I barely remembered had left me a life I never wanted. But on my first night there, I saw something in the mirror, and it was staring back at me. 12 years. That's how long it had been since my father vanished without a trace. No body, no explanation. Just a single missing person report. That led nowhere. I barely remembered him. My mother never spoke about him after he left. Any questions I asked as a child were met with tense silence. So when I got the call from the attorney saying I'd inherited his old apartment in Northwood, my first reaction was nothing. Not grief, not relief. Just an odd, detached feeling, like hearing about a distant relative's passing, someone you never really knew. I almost didn't go. Almost told them to sell the damn thing and send me a check. But something stopped me. Curiosity? Guilt? Or maybe just the weight of unfinished history pressing down on me. So I drove upstate on a rainy Thursday evening, feeling like I was stepping into someone else's life. The apartment. The building was old, not in a charming historical way. More like a forgotten relic from the 1980s. Flickering hallway lights, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the walls. Apartment 3B. That was his. That was mine now. I hesitated before unlocking the door. For some reason, I half expected it to resist, like the apartment itself knew I didn't belong here. But it swung open with a low, creaking sound. The first thing that hit me was the stillness. Not just silence, something deeper. The air inside was thick, unchanged, as if time had stalled the moment he disappeared. The furniture was exactly as he'd left it. A small couch facing an ancient television, a coffee table cluttered with books, their pages yellowed with age, a half-burned candle on the nightstand, and the mirror. It was the only thing that didn't belong. The mirror large. Too large for the room. It stood in the corner of the bedroom, angled toward the bed, in a way that felt deliberate. The frame, dark, twisted wood, almost organic-looking, like roots had grown and hardened over centuries. I shivered. Something about it made my skin itch. I don't like mirrors, never have. Not in that childish, superstitious way. But there's something about them. Something unsettling. Like they're waiting. I looked away, forced myself to focus on anything else. Settling in, I set my bag down on the bed and sighed. What was I supposed to do with this place? Sell it? Burn it? Pretend it didn't exist? I walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge out of habit. Empty. Of course. I shut the door and something moved. Not in the room, in the mirror. My heart lurched and I turned fast. Nothing. Just my own reflection, staring back at me. I exhaled, shook my head. Get a grip. I hadn't eaten all day. I was exhausted from the long drive. My brain was playing tricks on me, that's all. The first night. By the time I changed into an old t-shirt and lay on the bed, it was past midnight. I kept my back to the mirror. It was irrational, I knew that. But something about sleeping while it loomed behind me made my stomach twist. The apartment was eerily quiet. Not normal apartment quiet, where you hear the occasional pipes creak, a neighbor's muffled TV. No, this was silent, like the walls were holding their breath. I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly, and that's when I heard it. A soft creak. I froze, not in the room, inside the mirror. The dream. Or was it? I don't remember falling asleep. I remember floating, that weightless sensation where your body shuts down, but your mind lingers in the dark, caught between wakefulness and something else. And then, I was standing in the bedroom, But it wasn't right. The walls looked softer, blurred at the edges, like a painting left in the rain. The air thicker, heavy with something damp, rotting. I turned toward the mirror, and someone was inside it. Not a reflection, not me. A man. He stood deep in the glass, just out of reach, his features warped, like ripples on water, and he was watching me. I tried to move, couldn't. He raised his hand, pressed it against the glass. Fingers too long, nails too black. And then I woke up. Morning after sunlight streamed through the curtains. My heart was pounding, hard. I sat up, chest heaving, tried to shake off the dream, but something wasn't right. The mirror. It was closer than before. Not by much, maybe just an inch. But I knew exactly where it had been the night before, and I hadn't touched it. The morning felt different. Not in an obvious way. There were no strange noises, no immediate horrors waiting for me in the kitchen. But something about the air in the apartment felt off, like the silence had thickened overnight. I rubbed my eyes and looked toward the mirror. It hadn't moved, or at least I didn't think so, but the feeling of being watched still clung to me like a second skin. I told myself it was just the dream lingering, the unease of stepping into my father's abandoned life. But I still avoided looking directly into the mirror as I got up. I spent the morning going through my father's things. It was strange, digging through a dead man's life. His drawers were still filled with old receipts, loose change, keys to who knows what. A coffee mug sat in the sink, coated in dried stains. His closet still smelled like him. A faint mixture of old books and aftershave. Everything was frozen in time, like he had just stepped out for a moment, like he had never really left. I found his journal tucked away in the nightstand drawer. It was small, black, leather-bound, the kind of notebook you'd expect someone to fill with mundane to-do lists or grocery reminders. But the pages were filled with something else. Dates, notes, and the same phrase, written over and over again. Do not look too long. My skin prickled. I kept flipping. Some pages had sketches, quick, erratic pencil marks, figures, faces, but they were wrong. Too elongated, too thin, as if someone had stretched them like wax until their features barely resembled something human. And one of the drawings looked eerily similar to the shape I thought I saw in the mirror last night. My throat went dry. I closed the journal and forced a laugh. This was ridiculous. I was letting the isolation, the weight of the past, get into my head. Maybe my father had suffered from some kind of paranoia before he disappeared. Maybe that's why he left. Maybe that's why no one ever found him. I put the journal back and went to take a shower, pushing the thoughts away. Steam filled the small bathroom, curling against the mirror above the sink. For the first time that morning, I felt normal. The rush of hot water drowned out the silence of the apartment, and for a moment, I could pretend I was somewhere else, somewhere safe. But as I wiped the condensation from the mirror, I froze. Something was wrong with my reflection. At first, I thought it was just the leftover steam, distorting the image. But the longer I stared, the more I realized my reflection's smile was slightly off-center. I wasn't smiling, but my reflection was. Just barely. A fraction of a smirk. Subtle enough to make me doubt myself. My stomach turned. I lifted my hand slowly. So did my reflection. I turned my head. So did he. Everything was the same. Except for the smile. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my normal face staring back, the exact same expression. For a long moment I just stood there, the sound of water still running behind me. My pulse pounded in my ears. Had I imagined it? Was I just seeing what I expected to see after reading my father's journal? I let out a shaky breath and turned away, shutting off the water. I didn't look in the mirror again. Later that evening, as I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through my phone, it rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me I should. "Hello?" Silence. Then a woman's voice, soft, urgent. "You shouldn't have come back." A chill shot through my spine. "Who is this?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. A pause. Then just before the line clicked dead, I swore I heard her whisper, "Don't look at it too long." I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the not quite smile in the mirror. I kept the lights on, but the apartment still felt dark. Still felt like something was watching me. At some point, exhaustion won. My body shut down, dragging me into uneasy dreams. And then, I heard a sound, software distant, like someone breathing in the dark. I forced myself to sit up, my heart pounding. The room was still, but the mirror was wrong. Not moved, not cracked, but wrong. The reflection was slightly off, as if the room inside it had a different weight, a different presence, and just as I was about to turn away, something moved. Not my reflection, something deeper inside the mirror, watching, waiting, and this time, when I blinked, the smile didn't go away. It only widened. Morning came, but the fear from the night before didn't fade. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the mirror, fingers gripping the mattress so hard they hurt. I wanted to convince myself it had all been a trick of the mind. Exhaustion, stress, the weight of stepping into my father's abandoned life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside the mirror was aware of me, that it was waiting. I needed food, coffee, a distraction. Pulling on a hoodie, I shuffled to the kitchen, rubbing my temples. The headache hadn't stopped since I woke up. I reached for my phone to check the time, and it wasn't there. Frowning, I checked the nightstand, the kitchen counter, the pockets of the jeans I wore last night. Nothing. I was sure I had left it next to the bed. A tight unease settled in my gut. I sighed, shaking my head. I probably misplaced it. My brain was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was slipping, like pieces of my reality were being moved when I wasn't looking. I turned back toward the bedroom, eyes flicking toward the mirror, and my stomach dropped. My phone was there, inside the mirror, resting on the reflection of my nightstand. A cold wave of nausea rolled through me. I whipped around, looking at the real nightstand. Empty. I stared at the mirror again, breath sharp and uneven. The reflection should have matched the room exactly, but it didn't. In the real world, my phone was gone, but in the mirror, it was right where I had left it. For the first time in my life, I felt something I couldn't rationalize. A breaking of reality, a slow unraveling. I reached toward the mirror. Don't. The thought slammed into my brain like a warning from somewhere deep inside me, somewhere ancient. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding. The mirror just stood there, its glass smooth and undisturbed, and my phone still mocked me from inside it. I needed to leave. Throwing on my jacket, I turned toward the door, but just as my fingers touched the handle, something buzzed behind me. A phone. I turned slowly. The sound was coming from the mirror. My reflection's phone was ringing. The screen glowed with an incoming call, a name displayed in pale, eerie light. Unknown caller, the same number from yesterday. My blood turned to ice. The phone inside the mirror buzzed again. Then, without thinking, I reached into my pocket, and my real phone was there. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. The screen was dark. No missed calls. I looked up. The phone inside the mirror was still ringing. A slow, shaky step back. Then another. The moment my foot crossed the threshold out of the bedroom, the buzzing stopped. The phone inside the mirror vanished, like it had never been there at all. I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Mrs. Lowry. Apartment 3A. I remembered her name from the legal documents. An old woman, a longtime resident. If anyone knew what happened to my father, it was her. I knocked. Shuffling sounds. A pause. Then, the door cracked open, revealing a pale, wrinkled face. Her eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be here," she said. I exhaled sharply. "I know." Silence stretched between us. Then she sighed and opened the door wider. "Come in." Her apartment smelled like dust and mothballs. Stacks of old newspapers lined the walls. A cat slept on the armrest of a faded floral couch. She gestured for me to sit. I didn't. Instead, I got straight to the point. "My father lived here," I said. "He disappeared 12 years ago, and something is wrong with that apartment." Her expression darkened. She took a slow breath, staring past me like she was looking into some unseen place. Then she said, "That apartment doesn't belong in this building." A tight knot formed in my chest. "What do you mean?" Her lips pressed into a thin, grim line. 3B, she whispered, has been empty since 1978. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. I shook my head. "Number, that's not possible. My dad." "He wasn't supposed to be there," she cut in. "No one is. That apartment, it doesn't stay fixed in reality." I stared at her, my mind struggling to wrap around her words. "Then where the hell does it go?" Her gaze flicked toward the wall that separated our apartments. Then she whispered, "Sometimes it's here, in this world, and sometimes it's not." I sat in the apartment, staring at the mirror. Mrs. Lowry's words echoed in my head. That apartment doesn't belong here. It doesn't stay fixed in reality. I knew I should leave, but something in me didn't want to. Like a thread was pulling me deeper. The mirror stood silent in the corner. I should have turned it around, covered it, broken it, but I didn't. Instead, I stared at my reflection, and it stared back. Then, it moved, before I did. And this time, it wasn't smiling. I didn't move. Neither did my reflection. At least, not at first. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. A moment of exhaustion, of paranoia, of my brain filling in what it expected to see. But deep down, I knew. The version of me inside the mirror had moved before I did. It had acted on its own. And that meant it was no longer a reflection. It was something else. I forced myself to breathe, to break the moment before I spiraled further. I tore my eyes away from the mirror and walked out of the room. The moment I did, a sharp pain spiked behind my eyes. I stumbled, gripping the doorframe. The sensation was sudden, like stepping through an invisible wall, crossing from one atmosphere into another. I blinked hard, shaking my head. Dizziness. Disorientation. When I looked up, the apartment seemed different. Not in a physical way. More like the air was heavier. The walls leaned in just slightly. Like I had stepped into the same place but in a slightly alternate version of it. I turned back toward the bedroom. The mirror was still there, but my reflection was gone. I stared. The room inside the mirror was empty. I took a hesitant step forward. So did the floorboards in the reflection, but no version of me appeared. I waved a hand. Nothing. Cold fear settled in my gut. I wasn't being mirrored anymore. I was just looking into a room. Then, just as I took another step closer, the lights flickered, and for a split second, the reflection changed. The bedroom inside the mirror was no longer mine. The walls were darker, aged, as if abandoned for years. The nightstand had deep scratches across it like something had been clawing at the wood, and the bed was occupied. A shape lay under the covers, motionless. I opened my mouth, but before I could make a sound, the lights flickered again, and the reflection was back to normal. Except now I was there again, but I hadn't moved. And this time, my reflection wasn't mirroring me. It was facing me directly, watching, waiting. I backed away, breath uneven. The air felt wrong again, like I was in the wrong version of reality. I turned sharply and left the room, slamming the door behind me. The moment I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I grabbed it, hands shaking. Unknown caller. I hesitated. Then with a deep breath, I answered. "Hello?" Silence. Then a woman's voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone in there." The call cut out. A sharp bang came from the bedroom. I spun around, heart hammering. The door was still closed, but the air pressed in on me thick and suffocating. I knew without even looking that if I opened that door, something else would be waiting on the other side. And it wouldn't be me. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that other room, of something shifting beneath the sheets, of eyes watching from the mirror. At some point, I stopped checking the time. I just lay there, unmoving, waiting for the night to end. At dawn, I forced myself up. The bedroom door was still closed. The mirror was still inside, but I had the distinct, terrifying feeling that something had changed. I could feel it, like I wasn't the only version of myself in this apartment anymore. Like something else was here with me, and it was waiting for the right moment to take my place. I didn't open the bedroom door. Not that morning, not for hours. I knew something was inside. Not a person, not an intruder. Something else. Something that had my face. At some point, I convinced myself it was all in my head. Lack of sleep, isolation, a mind desperately trying to rationalize the impossible. So I did what any sane person would do. I left. I grabbed my keys, shoved on my jacket, and walked out of 3B without looking back. And yet, as I stepped into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the one leaving, that some other version of me was standing behind the door, watching me go, smiling, waiting. I wandered for hours. No destination. Just walked. The cold air burned my lungs, but for the first time in days, I felt like I was in the real world again. But then, the town felt off too. Subtle things. The streets were too empty for mid-morning. The coffee shop on the corner, the one I remembered from childhood, had no customers inside, and the people I did see, they weren't looking at their phones. They weren't talking. They just stood at crosswalks, at bus stops, on benches, watching. Not at me. Just watching. Like they were waiting for something. Like they were part of something I wasn't supposed to notice. A woman stood outside a grocery store, holding a bag of oranges. Not eating them, not moving, just staring at a fixed point in the distance. I turned a corner. A man stood on his porch, eyes locked straight ahead, unblinking. A group of kids at the playground sat perfectly still, like statues, their swings gently rocking in the wind. Something was wrong with this place. I ducked into a small convenience store, my heart hammering. It was the first normal-seeming place I had seen all morning. Behind the counter, a tired-looking clerk read a newspaper, barely acknowledging my presence. I grabbed a coffee just for the comfort of something warm, something routine. As I set it on the counter, I finally spoke. "Has this town always been this quiet?" The clerk froze. For the first time, he looked at me. Really looked at me. Then he leaned in, voice low. "You staying in 3B?" A chill ran down my spine. "How do you know that?" I asked. The man swallowed hard, glancing toward the door like he expected someone to walk in. Then in an even quieter voice, "That apartment ain't real, man." My breath caught in my throat. I tried to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he sighed. "People stay there, and then they don't." I waited, but he didn't say anything else. Just rang up my coffee, his hands trembling slightly. By the time I got back to the apartment complex, the sun was setting. The air had shifted again, like I was stepping into a slightly different version of the world. I walked up to the third floor, gripping my coffee. Then I stopped. My door was open, just an inch. I hadn't left it that way. I knew I hadn't. Slowly, carefully, I pushed it open, and I froze. Everything inside was reversed. The furniture, the layout, even the way the light hit the walls. It was the same apartment, but mirrored, and at the far end of the room, the mirror was gone. In its place, a door stood open, a doorway leading into a hallway that shouldn't exist, and from deep within that impossible space, footsteps. The sound was slow, deliberate, a wet, dragging noise, like bare feet on cold tile. The hallway beyond the door stretched into darkness, too long, too deep. It wasn't part of the apartment. It wasn't part of this world. I stepped back, and then, from the shadows, a hand gripped the edge of the doorway. Not my hand, not human. Too long, too thin. The fingers curled against the frame, pulling something forward. A shape, a figure. And then I saw it. I saw me. Not my reflection, not a copy. Something else, something wearing my face. And this time, it was smiling. I couldn't move. The thing in the doorway, the thing wearing my face, stood there, half shrouded in darkness. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. Its lips were pulled into that same off-center smirk I had first seen in the mirror. Except now it wasn't a trick of the glass. It was real. It had stepped through. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I stepped back, almost tripping over the couch. The thing in the doorway didn't move. Then, just as I blinked, the door vanished. Gone. Like it had never been there at all. I stood in the middle of my apartment, shaking. The mirror was back in its usual spot. The layout of the room was normal again, except for one thing. The mirror's glass was no longer reflecting anything. It was just black, a void. And from somewhere deep inside that darkness, I could feel it, breathing, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep. I barely moved. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a half-conscious haze on the couch. That's when I saw it, the journal. My father's journal, sitting on the coffee table in front of me. I didn't remember leaving it there. With shaking hands, I flipped through the pages again. The same warnings, the same sketches of elongated faces and shifting figures inside mirrors. Then, something new. Tucked between the pages was an old, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline sent a shock of cold terror through my chest. Man vanishes without a trace in apartment 3B. The article was dated 1978. I scanned the text, my breath catching on the details. A man named Richard Latham had lived in 3B. One night, his neighbors heard strange noises, knocking, whispers. Then, silence. The next morning, Richard was gone. No signs of forced entry. No personal belongings missing. Just an empty apartment. And one last unsettling detail. His bedroom mirror was shattered from the inside. I ran next door. I pounded on 3A's door, breathless. Mrs. Lowry opened it, her eyes widening the moment she saw me. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. I swallowed hard. What the hell is happening? She pulled me inside, shutting the door behind me. For a long moment, she just stared at me. Then, finally, she spoke. "That mirror isn't just a mirror." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" She exhaled shakily. "It's a doorway." She led me to a dusty bookshelf in the corner and pulled out a faded blue notebook. "Your father wasn't the first," she said. I flipped through the notebook, my stomach turning with every page. Dozens of names, dates. Each entry followed the same pattern. A new tenant moves into 3B. They start seeing strange things in the mirror. They hear voices, feel watched. Then, one day they vanish. Gone. Erased from reality. Like they had been replaced. I looked up at her. My throat was dry. Why didn't anyone stop it? Her lips tightened. Because we don't know how. She reached forward, gripping my wrist. If you're still here, that means it wants you. Her fingers dug into my skin. You need to leave, before it's too late. I left her apartment in a daze. I needed to get out, to pack a bag and never look back. But deep inside me, I already knew the truth. It was too late. The moment I stepped back into my apartment, I felt it. The shift, like the walls weren't in the same place they had been before. Like the air itself had a different weight. The lights flickered. And then, in the corner of the bedroom, the mirror shuddered. Not the frame, the glass itself. Something on the other side was trying to step through. And this time, I wasn't sure if I could stop it. I couldn't move. The thing in the doorway, the thing wearing my face, stood there, half shrouded in darkness. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. Its lips were pulled into that same off-center smirk I had first seen in the mirror. Except now it wasn't a trick of the glass. It was real. It had stepped through. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I stepped back, almost tripping over the couch. The thing in the doorway didn't move. Then, just as I blinked, the door vanished. Gone. Like it had never been there at all. I stood in the middle of my apartment, shaking. The mirror was back in its usual spot. The layout of the room was normal again, except for one thing. The mirror's glass was no longer reflecting anything. It was just black, a void. And from somewhere deep inside that darkness, I could feel it, breathing, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep. I barely moved. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a half-conscious haze on the couch. That's when I saw it, the journal. My father's journal, sitting on the coffee table in front of me. I didn't remember leaving it there. With shaking hands, I flipped through the pages again. The same warnings, the same sketches of elongated faces and shifting figures inside mirrors. Then, something new. Tucked between the pages was an old, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline sent a shock of cold terror through my chest. Man vanishes without a trace in apartment 3B. The article was dated 1978. I scanned the text, my breath catching on the details. A man named Richard Latham had lived in 3B. One night, his neighbors heard strange noises, knocking, whispers. Then, silence. The next morning, Richard was gone. No signs of forced entry. No personal belongings missing. Just an empty apartment. And one last unsettling detail. His bedroom mirror was shattered from the inside. I ran next door. I pounded on 3A's door, breathless. Mrs. Lowry opened it, her eyes widening the moment she saw me. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. I swallowed hard. What the hell is happening? She pulled me inside, shutting the door behind me. For a long moment, she just stared at me. Then, finally, she spoke. "That mirror isn't just a mirror." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" She exhaled shakily. "It's a doorway." She led me to a dusty bookshelf in the corner and pulled out a faded blue notebook. "Your father wasn't the first," she said. I flipped through the notebook, my stomach turning with every page. Dozens of names, dates. Each entry followed the same pattern. A new tenant moves into 3B. They start seeing strange things in the mirror. They hear voices, feel watched. Then, one day they vanish. Gone. Erased from reality. Like they had been replaced. I looked up at her. My throat was dry. Why didn't anyone stop it? Her lips tightened. Because we don't know how. She reached forward, gripping my wrist. If you're still here, that means it wants you. Her fingers dug into my skin. You need to leave, before it's too late. I left her apartment in a daze. I needed to get out, to pack a bag and never look back. But deep inside me, I already knew the truth. It was too late. The moment I stepped back into my apartment, I felt it. The shift, like the walls weren't in the same place they had been before. like the air itself had a different weight. The lights flickered, and then, in the corner of the bedroom, the mirror shuddered. Not the frame, the glass itself. Something on the other side was trying to step through, and this time, I wasn't sure if I could stop it. I was trapped, inside the mirror, inside a twisted version of my own apartment that wasn't real. The air was thick, suffocating. The walls felt too close together, like they were breathing. The furniture was off, the edges sharper, the shadows deeper. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. Because I wasn't in my world anymore. I was inside the reflection, and he, the thing that had taken my place, was gone. At first, I thought maybe I was hallucinating, that if I just closed my eyes, if I just willed myself awake, I'd snap back into reality. But I didn't. I was still here, and the apartment around me was wrong. The lights were dimmer, their glow a sickly yellow. The air hummed with an unsettling low-frequency vibration, like something huge was moving just out of sight. I turned to the mirror, but it wasn't a mirror anymore. It was a window, and on the other side, I saw my real apartment, the normal one. And inside it I saw him. The thing that had stolen my face moved around the apartment like it belonged there, like it had been me all along. It touched my belongings. It made coffee. It scrolled through my phone. At one point it laughed, and I realized with a jolt of horror that I could hear it, like the sound was bleeding through the glass. I pounded on the mirror. "Hey, let me out." No reaction. It didn't even glance in my direction, because to him, I wasn't there. To him, I didn't exist anymore. I was already erased. I felt something shift behind me, a presence, slow, deliberate. I turned, and I wasn't alone anymore. Shadows gathered in the corners of the apartment, tall, thin figures just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt them staring. They stood perfectly still, silent, waiting, and the moment I noticed them, they started moving. At first they didn't walk, they glided, slow, unnatural, like they weren't bound by the same laws of movement I was. Their shapes flickered as if they weren't fully solid, just echoes of something else, something trapped here with me, something that had once been like me. Then one of them spoke, not with a voice, not out loud, but inside my head, a single whispered phrase, "You don't belong out there anymore." A cold, sick dread spread through my chest. They were right. I didn't belong in the real world anymore, because I wasn't part of it. I was part of this. I backed away, pressing my hands against the cold glass of the mirror. The figures stopped. They didn't follow, and that's when I understood. There were rules to this place. They couldn't touch me unless I moved too far from the mirror. They didn't attack. They waited, because this wasn't a prison. It was a process, and I was just the next in line. I turned back to the mirror, to him. The thing wearing my face had left the apartment, gone out into the world, into my life. I had been swapped, replaced, and now I was waiting for the next unlucky soul to move into apartment 3B. Because when they did, when they looked too long into the mirror, I'd have a chance to take their place, just like my reflection had done to me. Time didn't exist in the mirror. I don't know how long I stood there staring out at my life, my world, my body, now belonging to something else. It had walked out of my apartment, into my reality, and I was stuck here, waiting, just like the ones who had come before me. The figures in the shadows never spoke again, but they didn't leave either. They stayed at the edges of the apartment, watching me. Or maybe not me exactly. Maybe they were just waiting for their turn. Some of them had been here for decades. I could feel it. The weight of their existence stretched out across time. Not dead, not alive, just stuck, like me. I didn't try to talk to them. What would be the point? We all knew how this ended. We all knew the only way out. Through the glass, I watched the days pass. The thing that had replaced me. It was good at pretending. It laughed with my friends. It went to my job. It even answered my texts. No one noticed, no one knew. I had been erased, and he was all that remained. I pounded on the mirror. I screamed. No sound came out. No one heard me. No one would ever hear me. Because I wasn't real anymore. Then one day, it happened. I saw him, the next tenant, a young man, maybe in his 20s. He stepped inside apartment 3B, looking around with that same hesitant curiosity I had felt when I first arrived. He had no idea, no clue that he was already marked, that the process was already starting, that he was next. I pressed both hands against the glass. My breath hitched. This was it. My chance. The new tenant walked into the bedroom. His eyes drifted to the mirror. For a moment I saw hesitation. I saw the way his shoulders tensed. He could feel it, even if he didn't understand why, even if he didn't know the danger. I stared at him. He stared at me. And then, he stepped closer. The glass shuddered. The process had begun. Just like it had for me. Just like it had for all of us. I knew what was going to happen. I knew how this ended. One of us would leave. One of us would be free. And the other, they would take my place. The way I had taken someone else's. The way they had taken mine. The reflection never breaks. It only repeats. 1 inch, 1 out. That's how it's always been. And now all I had to do was wait for him to look just a little too long. The new tenant was staring at the mirror. His gaze lingered just a little too long. And that was all it took. I felt the shift. The apartment itself seemed to breathe. The air pressing in, thick and suffocating. Like something unseen had just woken up. It was happening. The swap had begun. The young man frowned. He reached toward the glass, just like I had. His fingertips hovered inches from the surface. I pressed my own hands against the other side. I could feel it, the invisible pull, the thread of reality unraveling. I could feel his fear, his confusion, the same fear I had felt, the moment before everything flipped. Then, for a second, he hesitated. He started to pull away. My heart slammed against my ribs. No. It wasn't supposed to stop. I was supposed to be free. If he turned away now, if he broke the connection, I'd be trapped here forever. The reflection never breaks. It only repeats. I had to make him stay. For the first time. I did something I shouldn't have been able to do. I moved first. Before he did. Not a reaction. Not a mirror image. I leaned forward, but his body did not. His eyes widened. I smiled. Just like mine had. Just like all the others before me had. And I watched his face shift. From curiosity to horror. Because in that moment, he understood. The air cracked like ice breaking. The lights flickered. The room twisted inward, folding at impossible angles. Then, I felt the pull, a violent, all-consuming yank. Like gravity had flipped upside down, like I was being dragged back into reality, like I was being erased from this place. I barely had time to see the young man's face as I was ripped away. But I felt his scream. I felt him take my place. The mirror sealed shut. And just like that, I was back. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. The apartment was normal again. The walls, the light, the silence, like nothing had ever happened, like it had all been some terrible nightmare. I turned slowly toward the mirror. The glass was smooth, untouched, and on the other side, he was there now. The new tenant. His hands pressed against the glass, his mouth open in a silent scream. But no sound came through. No one would hear him, just like no one had heard me, because he wasn't real anymore. He was just a reflection. I took one last look, one final glance at the man who had unknowingly taken my place. Then I turned away. I grabbed my keys, and I walked out of apartment 3B, not looking back, never looking back. Because if I did, I knew what I'd see. I'd see him, still standing there, waiting. And if I looked too long, I might not be able to leave at all. I left town that night, drove until I was too far away to feel the weight of the apartment anymore, too far to feel the mirror's pull. I told myself I was free, that it was over, that I had escaped. But late at night, when I pass by mirrors in dimly lit rooms, sometimes I see something, a flicker, a shadow, a version of myself that isn't quite right. And I wonder, did I ever really escape? Or did something else come back instead? Do you feel that chill? It was a full circle. The mirror never breaks, it only repeats the process.